Hello, everyone, and special thank you for taking time out of your busy day to join us. I know we're all in various time zones, and it's a very busy time of year. So we're excited to have you with us, and we know this will be a really engaging webinar, and you won't have any regrets for taking this small time to listen with us. This is actually a very special webinar as it marks the first in what we hope is a very engaging webinar series. So as many of you may know, this webinar is being hosted today by the Community-Based Child Protection in Emergencies Task Force, which is part of the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. This is formerly known as the Child Protection Working Group, or the CPWG. Our task force is co-led by Plan International, World Vision, and UNICEF. And this particular component of our work plan, the webinar series, intends to provide an opportunity for us to engage, to exchange knowledge and learn from both of our successes and failures. It's also integral to improving and advancing our sector because it supports coordination and linkages with other agencies and groups, institutions such as academic institutions and coordinating bodies, and it brings together learnings beyond our child protection sector. So as we move forward through the webinar series, we hope to engage other sectors such as WASH and education to really try to bridge the gap of learning between all of these various areas of practice. And we hope this promotes information sharing among us and eventually improve the quality of our response on the ground, especially alongside community. So this webinar, and hopefully the rest of the series, has been heavily supported by the Community Child Protection Exchange, who is a member of our task force, in particular Lucy Hillier, who is actually the mastermind behind getting us an opportunity with Philip Cook. So I would like to just sincerely thank her for her efforts and to hand over the mic to her to introduce Philip along with some of the other basic rules of today's webinar.
Hi there, everyone, and thanks, Alex, for that nice introduction. And hello from Joburg, for those of you who are tuning in from I don't know where. So welcome, yes, to this webinar, Community Engagement to Strengthen Social Cohesion and Child Protection in Chad and Burundi. I wanted to just say I'm also excited about this first webinar in this series of webinars. So we'll be looking at community-based, community-driven child protection in the various contexts. So I'll introduce our presenters just in a short while, but I also wanted to just mention the people who are supporting this webinar apart from myself and who are kind of behind the scenes. So obviously Alex Chaperon from Plan International, who's just been introducing this webinar, and also who's helping us in terms of, at the moment, the technical issues around the WebEx. So Christine Nicolaides, thanks, she's there. If you want to send her a message on the chat, you're very welcome to. Also, I think, Alex, you're going to be monitoring the chat and collecting questions. So if you do have queries or comments about anything that's being discussed, or you want to send in a question for the Q&A later on, please feel free to send it in the chat, and Alex will be sort of collecting them and sending them through to me. Maybe we need a couple of just quick outline of the webinar today, as well as some of the, I don't want to say rules, but how it will work. So we reckon it will take us about an hour to get through this webinar. We've got two presenters who I'll introduce in a second, who will speak for about 30 minutes in total, and then there's going to be about 20 minutes for them to answer some of your questions. So like I said, if you want to ask a question, please do use the chat function. Also, just a note to say, we have turned off your microphones, so you really can only use the chat function to communicate, and it's not because we don't want to hear your voices, it's because, as you know, there's a lot of people on the line and it tends to make a bit of background noise and disturb the communications. We might not have time for all of your questions, but don't feel that we're ignoring you if you don't hear me asking your question at the end. In fact, we're actually taking all of your questions and comments into account, And they're really going to also feed into helping us determine what kinds of webinars, what sorts of themes and topics might we want to feature for the rest of the series. And in fact, thinking on that note, if we're really quite interested in finding out what you all know. So if you've got any ideas or maybe some research or learning that you think would be good to share, feel free, don't be shy to get in touch with any of us, and we can, have a discussion. So we are looking for input from all of you as well. We don't know everything that's out there, and I'm pretty sure a lot of you do know about some very useful and interesting research or evidence or learning that could be shared further. Just to let you know, we're recording this webinar. We will post the recording probably on the Exchange's YouTube channel as soon as we can. I can't give you the link right now, but we will send it through. If you aren't on the Exchange's mailing list, you might want to send a quick note here, either directly to me or one of us by email or even on this chat, so we can add you, and we will alert you to the link for forthcoming events and also the link for this webinar recording. So I'll move on now and just introduce our speakers. So we're really happy to welcome Dr. Philip Cook and Armel Oguniyi. Sorry, Armel, if I've also not said your name correctly. Both from the International Institute for Child Rights and Development, which from now on we're going to call the ICRD. And they're going to talk us through some recent research, which is called the Community Engagement to Strengthen Social Cohesion and Child Protection in Chad and Burundi. And that's also known as bottom-up participatory monitoring, planning, and action. So a little bit about Philip. Dr. Philip Cook is the founder and current executive director of the International Institute for Child Rights and Development and faculty at Royal Roads University in Canada. He's been working in children's rights and child protection research, policy, and practice for over 25 years, and this has involved development and humanitarian partnerships with diverse government agencies and civil society organizations, including child-led organizations. And just a little bit about the IICRD, it promotes bottom-up approaches to child protection system strengthening that leads with children, their family, and communities in various cultural and situational contexts. And Philip describes himself as a research/stroke practitioner, and his publications, lectures, and public speaking draw from IICRD's rich experience of working with many child protection practitioners, with children, with families, and communities on issues of human adversity, human resilience, and human well-being. So welcome, Philip. And I'll just introduce here Armel as well, and then I'm going to hand over to them both. So Armel is an associate of the IICRD and joins us today from Benin in West Africa. Currently, Armel works for Right to Play, which is, for those of you who don't know, an international humanitarian NGO. He's the Africa Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Officer at the Regional Office for Africa Program. And Armel really brings us some great experience today in participatory data collection tools, techniques, as well as data processing and analysis. And he's been working alongside Philip on the study that they are going to present today. And something else you might want to know is Armel and his wife also funded a local NGO. And you can correct me later on this, Armel, if I don't say it. My Yoruba is not great. It's named Ilosiwaju Africa, which means Development of Africa in Yoruba, which works to actively engage with communities, children, and youth. So welcome, Armel. I'm going to stop talking now and just hand over to Philip so he can start his presentation. Philip, between you and Armel, you have 30 minutes. I may jump in and just let you know that you've got 5 minutes before the end. And many thanks, and over to you, Philip.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Can you hear me okay?
All good.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you to everyone. I noticed a few familiar faces as people are checking in to the webinar, so it's a great pleasure to be hosting the webinar and sharing it with my good friend and colleague, Armel. I should also say there was another IICRD associate who was involved in the work in Burundi. Armel led in Chad, and that colleague is Jean Siwanu. Unfortunately, Jean couldn't be with us on this call today, but I'd just like to recognize him at the outset. I'd also like to say what a great pleasure it is to be able to help launch this series, which I'm sure will be very rich and diverse and very needed. And I'm particularly pleased, as Lucy was saying, to be here in a role as not just a researcher, but somebody who's deeply passionate about child protection practice. So at the outset, I'll state that this is meant to share some of the results of our participatory research, but I'm very much hoping it's accessible and useful for practitioners, and we really welcome your questions and comments and constructive criticism at the end too. That's, after all, how we learn best. So getting started, as Lucy was saying, this work took place in Chad and Burundi and was really focused on the role that communities can play, not only in strengthening child protection systems, but more broadly, social cohesion in situations of conflict and post-conflict. And the slide you can see in the first PowerPoint image is taken from our work in Chad, where we were working very close to the border with the Central African Republic, also dealing with the consequences of the conflict in Nigeria with Boko Haram, who were making incursions into Chad as we were doing our work. So very complex situation, and seated in the circle in the image are the traditional leader on the left, the Mbang, which I'll come back to in the end, the community members, including women and youth in the center, and our colleagues from government and the NGO sector on the right, particularly our lead NGO at ED. So it brings together these diverse actors to really look at how formal systems can better interact with non-formal systems, and I think particularly in this context, how child protection could be an entry point more broadly for communities to be leading a process of broader peace building and social cohesion. And we'll come back at the end of the presentation to what's really truly community-led versus community-based. The background to the work in Chad and Burundi, which I should say also was supported by UNICEF, and we're very grateful for UNICEF's support. The focus of the work was to position ourselves within the broader learning that's taking place in community-based child protection mechanisms. This is an endeavor that started in the development sector and is now becoming much more widespread in conflict and post-conflict settings. We all know that community-based child protection mechanisms are becoming much more popular, and rightly so, given the importance of involving communities, but there's still a dearth of good evidence in terms of ways in which they're working and perhaps not working. One of the issues we were particularly interested in is the aspect of context, because in many instances, we know that externally driven child protection mechanisms tend to suffer because of lack of ownership from local community members and lack of sustainability quite often when INGOs or government partners pull out or funding is cut back or direct support is weakened, then often these systems can wither on the vine. And these shortcomings are particularly serious for children in their communities in conflict settings where many of the government systems of protection have been either eroded, damaged, weakened, or may not be present at all. And I'll come back to that in the context of Chad and Burundi, because the role of government in each of those countries was very different. And in some ways it was very helpful, and in some ways it was actually a hindrance to the work that was being done to try and promote both child protection and social cohesion. The specific objectives of the work in Chad and Burundi were to, first of all, look at how groups at the community level, and particularly focusing on children, youth, women and girls, and traditional leaders, were promoting social cohesion, peace building, and general human security. Within that question, we were interested in the specific drivers of conflict. So what were the underpinnings of the conflict, and how could these drivers be understood in relation to specific protection risks that children might be facing and harms, as well as protective mechanisms. Secondarily, we were interested in the influence that non-formal or community mechanisms and formal sectors, the role of government played in communities, and how did this differ both in different regions of the country as well as from one country to another. Thirdly, what were the group characteristics, activities, functions, processes, and mechanisms that actively support or erode social cohesion and child protection? And how did child protection itself play a role, and particularly we were interested in the role of community-based mechanisms and the work that had been done to strengthen community-based child protection mechanisms in Chad and Burundi and the influence that might have been having in broader social cohesion. And finally, what is the agentive role of youth, women's groups, and traditional leaders? And by this we mean, what are the opportunities and limitations for these groups' meaningful participation at the community level? Where is there the social space or the ways in which these groups can participate, and how are those things being hindered, not only by the conflict, but by other limitations in the local social ecological context? As I mentioned at the outset, Chad was one of the countries where we were working. As you can see from the arrows in the lower half of the picture, we were deeply engaged in the Sahel region, particularly Kumra in southern Chad, close to the border with Central African Republic. So many issues of mobility, in this case, from Chad in and out of Central African Republic. Also, as I mentioned, issues of mobility and large numbers of displaced populations coming over the border from Nigeria as a result of the conflict with Boko Haram. Similarly, conflict on the borders with Sudan and Libya. So you can see Chad is really in the middle of many countries undergoing conflict. And although Chad itself has been relatively peaceful for the past 10 years or so, it's a country that's cursed in many ways by being surrounded by other conflict situations. So we were interested in the consequences of that for local child protection efforts. Our local partner in Chad was an organization called ARED, a local NGO, and I'll come back to that in terms of the sustainability and opportunities that was being supported by UNICEF in the broader context of child protection, including trafficking. Human trafficking is an issue on the border, particularly in relation to pastoralist boys working with cattle in that region. In Burundi, we were working with the International Rescue Committee, IRC, and also with a local NGO called FVS Ahmad, which had been tasked by the government and supported by UNICEF in creating local child protection committees, and we were engaged in the research in Baruri and Makamba provinces in the Deep South. And both of those areas have received large numbers, originally received large numbers of displaced populations from Congo and former refugees returning from Tanzania, and now is a place where there's an exodus, obviously, of people leaving the country as a result of the more recent conflict following the elections in Burundi. And I'll come back to that as well in terms of the consequences for our work. The research methods that we used in the project were a combination of ethnographic, deep narrative conducted through semi-structured interviews with different groups of participants, including women, youth, traditional leaders, other local organization, religious leaders, and others. And also using participatory action research with children and youth, and particularly using child-centered games and activities that help to draw information on young people's perspectives on risk and protective factors, and also engage young people in discussions on solutions in regards to how some of those risks could be mitigated, and particularly looking at the role of young people in social cohesion and peace building more broadly. These tools draw on the work of IICRD, as Lucy mentioned at the outset, working with children as leading actors in strengthening child protection systems is an area of crucial interest for IICRD. And we've also been working with Mike Wessels and others to better understand the learning that's emerging in regards to the effectiveness of community-based child protection mechanisms and some of the limitations to that effectiveness. And although Mike was not directly involved in the research, he acted as an external advisor to the project. There were two primary phases to the work in Chad and Burundi. One was initially around the baseline research, using those methods that I've described. And the second phase of the project focused on helping to build capacity based on the results of the research, and particularly to use an approach that engaged local participants already working in child protection to develop their own action plans and indicators. And in this process, we decided to use an approach called outcome mapping. And for those of you who are more interested in outcome mapping, I believe there's a resource that's been attached to the webinar for more information. But we thought it would be an interesting way of both combining monitoring and evaluation and an action-based approach in which local community members were not only involved in developing action plans, but actually monitoring how well those plans worked in the end and being involved in further program strengthening in which they really owned their own knowledge and were engaged in applying that knowledge to strengthening both child protection and social cohesion. The outline of the training is in this slide, and we began with a broader discussion on systems approaches to child protection and the role that communities play in emergency contexts, particularly looking at the key role that our core stakeholders of women, youth, and elders played. Discussing rights-based approaches and both the importance of rights-based approaches and also some of the limitations or challenges in regards to rights-based approaches in emergency settings. There was a good deal of participatory work on understanding and exploring the unique risk and protective factors from the perspectives of each of those groups. And then we moved to the application of outcome mapping in developing common vision in terms of the overall objectives of the project, as well as looking at the specific mission or role that each group, whether it was women or youth or elders or other CBOs, played in reaching that mission. And that was quite important to see where they felt they were having the most influence and also where they felt that they were running into the greatest problems. And we used a variety of strategies, including developing these statements, exploring boundary partners, so different groups with whom they were working, and finally developing what are called in outcome mapping progress markers or indicators, and I'll come back to that in a moment, before actually developing and implementing action plans. And the results that I'm going to share today cover the first 3 to 4 months of those actions. So it's the preliminary findings, and we're going to do another round of data gathering just after Christmas. The training participants included diverse stakeholders. They were the original partners, local government, which included child protection workers, magistrates, police, in some instances, education and healthcare workers. Civil society was represented in the form of local NGOs, human rights organizations, radio stations, and other communication centers and communities. Youth groups in the 2 countries were represented by the Scouts, the Scout Burundien in Burundi, and an organization called ARMOC, which is a creative-based youth organization in Kumra, which was founded by youth and uses creative arts, so hip-hop, graffiti, other forms of music and drama to engage young people on issues of children's rights and more broadly youth in peace building. Women's groups were actively involved, and community faith and traditional leaders. And this was especially important for us. In Burundi, we worked very closely with the Bashinganate, who are traditional leaders who have been very actively involved historically in Burundi on issues of dispute resolution, and particularly issues related to land use and disputes over land, which obviously is very much at the center of the conflict in Burundi. And recently they've been sidelined by the government, and there's quite a lot of frustration on the part of the Bashinganate that they're not more involved. There have also been issues in terms of power dynamics within communities in which women's groups have complained that sometimes the Bashinganate have excluded the voice and the role of women. And so there's some important dynamics here that we wanted to explore in terms of the opportunity to work more closely with them, also looking at where there might be limitations. In Chad, we worked with the Mbang, who are a similar type of traditional leader involved in decisions on well-being and community balance and dispute resolution in Chad communities. This is a photograph of one of the activities with the women's group developing their mission statement and exploring their boundary partners. And I think Armel is going to come back to that at the end of the presentation to talk more specifically about the role of boundary partners. On the right, you can see a description of some of the root causes of the conflict in Burundi, beginning with the issue of displaced children at the top in green, and then moving down from that, that being caused by community violence, which is a result of political conflict, which is a result of the ethnic conflict, going all the way back over lack of land and the lack of arability of land, that the land isn't producing the way it used to. So there's a need for greater parcels of land to produce the same amount of food. These are some of the results of the work in Chad, where we can see one of the dimensions of the conflict that people were exploring was justice and injustice and the role of government on the top right. And in the center of the diagram, the issue of poverty, and a very interesting discussion again on the lack of arable land, the role of climate change, and particularly movement of peoples as a result of climate change, where community members have noticed conflicts arising because the pastoralist communities are coming to their communities at a time of the year when they're just beginning to seed their crops. In the past, this would have been in a different time of the year, and that's resulting in violence as a result of cattle wandering over crops that are just being planted, and also disturbing sacred places in the forest. And this is one of the issues that was at the center of the research. On the right, you can see the boundary partners, and I won't speak too much about this because I know Armel is going to come back to it. Only to say that what was interesting here was to explore with groups partners with whom they were working, which are the solid squares, and those who they were not working with but felt would be important. So, for example, in the dotted ones, you could see there were specific NGOs who were left out of their current work in child protection, who they felt would be strategic in addressing social cohesion, and also other community radio groups, etc., including youth. This table represents a summary of some of the key risk and protective factors and the root causes, and I won't go through all of them, only to say that what was important as an emergent theme in the risk factors was that it wasn't only risk factors associated with the conflict directly or conflict over land, but secondary risk factors in regards to children's vulnerability as a result of that conflict. For example, teen pregnancy, people said, had gone up since the conflict because girls were no longer being protected by their families, or they had to leave the family at a younger age to seek employment. And that often resulted in girls becoming pregnant in out-of-wedlock births. Similarly, the secondary effect of HIV/AIDS as family protective mechanisms broke down, they said, had an impact on child protection, as did the number of orphans resulting from AIDS and other aspects of the conflict. And a key issue that came up a lot, particularly in Burundi, was the politicization of youth and the violence amongst youth or between youth. And I want to come back to this at the end because it was a particularly challenging dimension of our work in Burundi, to a lesser degree in Chad, in regards to the role that youth play in communities, and particularly the way youth engagement can be corrupted during conflict and after conflict, particularly in situations like Burundi, where ethnic divisions are used to divide communities, not to strengthen social cohesion. In regards to the protective factors, number of key issues emerged. One was this dual nature of the Bashinganate, that although people did have some reservations about their role, they felt ultimately that the traditional role of Bashinganate was critical, and they really wanted to see a strengthening of that role in a way that still allowed women and youth to be involved in that. And so there's a lot of discussion on emergent types of mediation circles, where Bashinganate were involved, but women and youth could also engage in that process, and the critical role of education as a secondary buffer that affected both child protection and also supported social cohesion and giving children opportunities to strengthen their skills and have a sense of hope for the future. I want to move now briefly to the focus on outcome mapping as a tool that we at IICRD and others around the world have used to engage community members in a more participatory process of indicator development. And this has been important for us because we use participatory action research a lot. We're interested in ways that communities can bring their own unique knowledge, and particularly looking at the role that different stakeholders play in that process to inform not only program development, but change more broadly within their communities. Without going into an in-depth discussion of outcome mapping, it's particularly interested in understanding complex systems-oriented situations. So the ones we were looking at were good examples of that, and I think child protection generally lends itself well to outcome mapping because of the systems thinking that's going on within child protection now. It's also helpful because it doesn't just have one indicator, sort of a tick box approach to indicators. Rather, it encourages people to think about graded change. So beginning with interventions and then just, thinking about if you were to have an intervention, what would be the minimal level of change that you would expect? So this would just be very lowest expectations of change, moving to things then that you might like to see where there's more active engagement and learning going on, and there's a bit more dynamism within the program, all the way through to things that you might love to see within your program, which are like your highest dreams and aspirations at the end of the day, and being able to engage communities and then coming back to these things later on to see which ones you actually met, which allows you then to vary the indicators with the input from the community and actually looking at what's working and what's not working. The other thing that's interesting with progress markers and outcome mapping indicators is that they are in and of themselves an action. So you'll see with the examples I'm going to give that the indicators actually become a type of action plan for communities. So they're very action-oriented, which we find to be particularly helpful in working with these community groups. This is an example of the youth progress markers from Chad, beginning with expect to see, and the action that they want to address is raising awareness within communities on issues of migration, particularly movement of young people, which included trafficking, and the way movement could be resolved through conflict resolution using different forms of youth engagement from communication through radio to participatory drama, etc. The lowest level of expectations that the youth had for this action were the formation of a youth steering committee, having some very early meetings with partners, developing their own messages, and perhaps recording one or two skits or dramas. Moving up to the things that they expect to like to see, and this was working within, I should say, a 3.5 month time period. Within 3.5 months, what they would have liked to see, so a higher level of expectation, was that 500 cases of child trafficking or migration had been documented, that they had actually delivered their radio presentations through these local radio stations, that they had had a number of meetings in the community, and that they documented some of this process working with ourselves and the local NGO, ARED. At the level of love to see, so this was their highest expectations, they actually wanted to see some of the cases resolved, that they would have gone to court, which, as we all know, is exceedingly difficult in most of these cases to actually bring them to court and have final resolution. So they were hoping that a minimum of 15 cases might be resolved. So this was a very high level of expectation for them, that there would be an improvement in the awareness on the issue widely spread within the community, and that there would actually be demonstrable results in terms of child protection. After 3.5 months, what were our initial findings? Well, it was quite remarkable. Youth had hosted 3 community meetings in which between 60 and just over 100 participants took place. These were all youth. They had presented their messages over the radio station in 5 presentations. They'd worked with ARED, the local partner, to document 500 cases, and 16 of these cases were already being lodged and taken up by the police. So although they hadn't been resolved, they'd actually been taken on by the local judiciary, and they felt this was a very significant achievement. They had encountered some difficulties, and again, this is really important, I think, to look at some of the challenges and to see how we learn from these challenges. One is that there had been elections during this period, local elections in Chad, and so everything had come to a standstill. And in fact, people were very mistrustful initially of their engagement because they felt it was caught up in the elections, and that perhaps they were electioneering for one of the parties. There'd also been a teacher strike, which had made their work with children in schools difficult. And because of the lack of their own resources in terms of cell phones and things, actually communicating with the partner had been challenging. Similarly, the women's group had success in their work with communities. They'd also worked with a group of local communities working, in this case, particularly on women's education issues, and they had similarly documented some of their work and worked to strengthen local resources or networks amongst women. They also had difficulties, in this case, more with transportation and the lack of support and opposition in some cases from traditional leaders, where the traditional leaders were resistant to women becoming involved in issues of peace building, partly because they felt that their own role was being threatened. We'll come back to this in the final conclusions. And the role with the traditional leaders, they felt, was to form a more permanent bond with the local government in both Chad and Burundi. The traditional leaders felt that they had been sidelined by the government, and they wanted to strengthen their relationship with government by forming a permanent committee that would meet to discuss issues of migration, some specific child protection issues, particularly harmful traditional practices like early marriages and FGM, and looking more broadly at peace building and social cohesion. Some of their difficulties also included the elections, the movement of the pastoralists, which coincided with these meetings and resulted directly in some of the conflicts I was discussing earlier as a result of fights that broke out over land use, and a challenging phenomenon in Chad where some of these herds of cattle are now being owned by military leaders in the Chadian army who then support one of the ethnic groups. They're called the Nizari. And so when these conflicts come to the attention of the government, there's often corruption. Sometimes the farmers themselves are punished when they raise the issues rather than the pastoralists, and there was a lot of ill feeling and ill will around that issue. Some of their strategies that they wanted to develop were to target what are called ferik, which are traditional gathering times, to discuss these things more directly, bringing pastoralists and farmer communities together, and to apply some of their traditional dispute resolution practices. I wanted to finish in speaking about the traditional leader, and particularly in the Chad case, the Mbang, by just sharing some of their particular work focused on harmful traditional practices. And this was really interesting because typically they had been thought of as the cause of the harmful traditional practices, but through the process of their work with IRED, they realized that some of these practices needed to change, although they wanted to keep some of the cultural traditions that went with them, some of the dances and the initiation ceremonies that weren't harmful to children, and you can see an example in this slide. And so they began working with a small number of girls, and this later spread to 5 pilot communities where they wanted to address not only issues of FGM, but also the boys working with the cattle and the migration and trafficking that was taking place with that. Moving to the conclusion of the presentation, the next steps that we're involved in now are finalizing the indicators and the final report. I should point out the report you have now is an almost final report. There's still a few typos and a couple of things that need to finish with that report. Also working with the communities to involve them more closely in ongoing monitoring. And finally, IICRD is working with the youth groups to accredit the work they're doing in the communities through what we're calling youth leadership stamps, which are both electronic stamps as well as a hard copy stamp that they receive for the work that they're doing on various issues around social cohesion, resilience building, community engagement, etc. I don't want to go into the detail of this slide, only to say that one of our objectives was to work with communities and UNICEF and IRED to develop an ongoing theory of change. And this is a representation of the adapted theory of change that came out of the work, which is being applied as the work continues. Some final reflections before I hand over to Armel. One, obviously, is the importance of context in these situations. Although Chad and Burundi share similar features of conflict in both countries, there are significant differences, particularly, as I mentioned, the fact that actually Chad has been fairly peaceful as a country, although it's surrounded by conflict. So the conflict in Chad is very much externally driven at the moment, which creates more opportunities, I think, for local stakeholders. Whereas in Burundi, as a result of the elections, there are deep divisions within communities, and you could even say that at this moment the government is against social cohesion, and as a result of that, some of these activities are extremely difficult. As a result of this, the role of government was very different in each of the countries, and it wasn't to say that the Ministry of Social Affairs wasn't involved in child protection in Burundi. It was only to say that people had much more mistrust of government in Burundi, which meant that the community stakeholders became much more important, and also it reduced the overall scope of the project to address social cohesion, leading to more of a focus on child protection. I'll come back to that momentarily. I think a key aspect of this that I mentioned earlier is the politicized role of youth in conflict settings, and we could see this very clearly in Burundi with the role of what are called the Imbonerakure, which literally or roughly translates as those who can see far, and these are the youth who both act as spies and instigators of violence for the government. And so often when we were having community meetings in the two provinces in Burundi, people would be very wary or mistrustful of some of the youth in the group, and it led to some really important discussions on how do people define their own communities. We often assume that communities are an amorphous structure that's defined geographically by people living in one place, but in Burundi, many of the communities are severely divided as a result of the conflict, and as I say, this led to significant difficulties in strengthening child protection and social cohesion. I think there's an important discussion in regards to what is community-based versus community-led, and realistically in this case, these were initiatives, I think, that were primarily community-based in the beginning and perhaps became more led by the community members, I would say, particularly in Chad, primarily because there was a local NGO that was leading those endeavors. But in Burundi, I think it's hard to get to that place at the moment, perhaps unrealistic to expect that communities will be leading these initiatives when there's actual danger involved in focusing on issues of social cohesion. In these kinds of situations, I think, given our focus on both child protection and social cohesion, it's often easier for organizations to focus primarily on child protection and hope that there will be some benefits to social cohesion, perhaps secondarily. And I think we could see some interesting opportunities in Burundi where, beginning with an emphasis on vulnerable children, vulnerable women were also somewhat empowered by the end of the project, or the role of the Bishinganate could be strengthened in a very low-level way, although realizing that we could not really go very far in broader social cohesion. In Chad, I think there were more opportunities because of the more widespread existence of peace in the country, where we could begin with child protection and move to social cohesion much more quickly. Although even in that context, given the corruption and other challenges I mentioned, it wasn't a simple endeavor. I think at the end of the day, though, this work does speak to the important role of women, youth, and traditional leaders as key allies and partners in this process, which even in the context of weak governance and corruption serves as an inspiration for the work that communities can do, and I think provides some important lessons for the local organizations and the need to support local organizations, particularly those like ARED, to take a greater leadership role and also provide food for thought for INGOs, so IRC, UN agencies like UNICEF and others in regards to the way they support those organizations and the critical role that they play, I think, in legitimizing that work and liaising with government to create a safe space for the organizations and those working within the organizations to carry out their mandate. And perhaps this aspect of indicators is an interesting way to take this forward, where in addition to the more typical programmatic interventions, communities are actually empowered to own their own knowledge and to use that knowledge to evaluate, monitor, and create new programs. And I'll stop there and hand over to Armel. Thank you for your patience. I know I've covered a lot of ground, and I look forward to the discussions afterwards.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Philip. And that was great. So, Armel, can we give you 5 minutes, and then we will ask a few questions? Over to you, Armel. You might need some help being unmuted, Christine.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me very well. Yeah, I just have a few comments to add. Just to mention that the training charge was a true opportunity for us to explore with the different groups participating the complex dynamics of child protection mechanisms, the formal and non-formal in Chad and Kumura, and while also understanding local power dynamics to social cohesion and peace building. And outcome mapping was such a powerful tool as it helped to not only build capacity of the different groups, but most importantly, it has promoted ownership of the project and also increased the participant accountability to the achievement of the different progress markers that we developed together in group. So from monitoring and evaluation learning perspective, I'd like to briefly comment that the activity related to the identification of the boundary partners has been one of the success factors in achieving progress markers they expect to see, they like to see, and they love to see. And during this activity, we engage each of the three groups, I mean the youth group, the women groups, and the group of the elders that we call the notables. We engage them in discussion and they identify those individuals, groups, and organizations with whom they could interact directly to implement the action plan and with whom they anticipate opportunities for influence. And it was just great since during implementation of action plans, the boundary partners were all very well, supportive and support the different groups in implementing the activities. And the result that we achieved in less than 3 months and a half of implementation were very incredible, as indicated in the report that we shared. And actors from formal and not formal child protection systems working together on the same activities maximize impact of action, and in many cases, expected results were even exceeded. And the different groups also understood and reported to us the necessity and importance of joining effort in networks for synergy. And the activity on the boundary partners identification also enable the participant to know more about roles, responsibilities, actions, domain of intervention of services, NGOs, groups working in Kumra on child protection and social cohesion related issues. And for us as well, this activity gives us opportunity to meet the youth of Amrock, with whom we are currently working with for the skill-based stamp process. And yes, this is just a few comments that I want to share to focus on the importance of the identification of the boundary partners when it comes to the outcome mapping process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Armel, and thanks, Philip, too. Okay, so we have I'd say about 10 minutes for questions. I have a few questions. I actually have one question I would like to ask first. And actually, Armel, what you were just talking about leads quite nicely into it. I wanted to go back, Philip and Armel, and just kind of highlight, I guess, generally this work where we are looking at community-based versus community-driven. One of the key factors that has been identified through some of the work that's been emerging in the last 10 years or so is is the influence of the power dynamics, both externally, perhaps an NGO or a community partner coming into a community, working with the community, and within the community themselves, and the sort of facilitation process that goes on when an organization decides to work with a community and vice versa, and consult with the community regarding what are its priorities, what would they like to do. One of the things we've identified through work is that often this is it may be called consultative, but it's hugely influenced by power dynamics, both externally and internally. Certain groups of people may not say what they're really thinking. They may agree because the leaders are saying something which they don't want to disagree with, although in their hearts they don't really agree. Therefore, there's a sort of decision that's made, but it's not really made with the true participation, the equal participation of all the different community members. And I wanted to ask you, in the process that you've been describing, I mean, how did that facilitation happen, and what do you think, in what sense do you think the power dynamics maybe influenced this process? And do you think this had any impact on the outcomes? And perhaps if you're thinking forward, if that was the case, where would you be going from here? Are there any approaches which might address this in the future? So it's really to just ask you to talk a little bit around the facilitation process. And I think maybe also just to add one of the questions that somebody sent us, perhaps to speak a bit more around how children in particular participated in the research. I think there's an interest to know, especially based on what you were saying around the politicization of some of the youth, etc. So those are two separate questions, but I guess linked. So I'll leave it to you, Philip and Armel, to try and answer that, and then maybe we'll have time for one or two more questions as well. Thanks.
Armel, should I take the lead, and then if you want to add anything, I welcome you coming in. Does that sound okay? Okay, I'll go ahead. So I think Lucy, in terms of your first call, both are really good questions. I think in terms of the power dynamics, obviously that's a key consideration because we're not dealing with a power neutral situation. The funding obviously is being managed by the international donors. The agenda was initially set by the donors in regards to the focus on child protection and social cohesion. Some of the initial capacity building approaches were obviously designed internationally and then brought to the community. So it's not a power neutral situation. Having said that, I think in both, particularly at the outset of the initiative, which started in 2014, actually before our engagement, there was widespread welcoming of this focus, both on child protection, where people felt there were deep needs in both countries, and the need for some sort of community mechanism. I don't think people knew exactly what those mechanisms should look like at that point, but I think there was a recognition that there was need for community mechanisms and that it would be helpful to frame the child protection work in the broader context of social cohesion, given the importance in each country, Burundi and Chad, on building peace. I think as the project proceeded and progressed, and particularly after the elections in Burundi, which took place about 2/3 of the way through the project, there was some pushback from the community in Burundi, particularly in regards to the limitations of a social cohesion approach. And I think that's when people actually raised the issue that it might be, in fact, even dangerous for people to be focusing on social cohesion, and it would be safer to limit the focus more to child protection. And that's where I think actually the timing of our intervention was quite helpful with regards to the outcome mapping, because I think people found that a very useful way, as Armel was saying, in terms of thinking about their own sphere of influence and the boundary partners and the limitations of that sphere of influence, to not only think about where they were working and how they were working, but how those concepts of child protection and social cohesion also had their limitations, and to be able to use the data that they were gathering to push back. In terms of the power dynamics when it came to youth, I'm not sure if we ever really overcame that in Burundi, because it's so difficult to talk about those things. There is so much fear in the communities after the elections in regards to the role of some of these youth groups who've been engaged in violent acts, that I think it was very hard to discuss. And maybe there were conversations going on that we weren't aware of. There probably were, but I had a sense that was almost a taboo area that was hard to talk about. So I would say that was probably a limitation in the work. I think also in terms of the power dynamics, I flagged the issue of the involvement of the traditional leaders. And I think we made some progress in having fruitful discussions on where traditional leaders were really appreciated and needed to be involved, and where, particularly in the case of women, people found it difficult with regards to their involvement. And I think to some degree that was overcome, although I think there's still a long way to go. I think the other issue when it comes to power that we haven't overcome, and I think it's common in both countries, is the issue of corruption that I mentioned, both with regards to political elites in Burundi and the violence that they're involved in, and in Chad, this aspect of the generals, for example, owning large herds of cattle and the way that undermined some of the local dynamics in terms of social cohesion and the ripple effect that had in child protection, where more boys had to move and migrate and were involved in trafficking, etc. So that's a somewhat complicated answer to your question, but I hope it raises some of the key considerations and complexities. In terms of children's engagement in the project, the tools themselves, I think, helped create a safe and trusting place for children to engage. I've shared one of our documents from IICRD. It's called the CAPE Guide, Child-Centered Accountability for Protection Evaluation, and some of those CAPE tools were useful in creating a safe space where children could come together and in a very playful but reflective way think about some of the risk and protective factors involved in their lives. I think the aspect of involving youth, so in Burundi, the Scouts, and in Chad, our MOC, was helpful to work with younger children because there was a strong level of trust between, we're really talking adolescents here, not younger children, but between the adolescents and the youth. And I think that aspect of working through youth to work with younger children worked quite well. Also realizing that when it came to young people being involved in more discussions on corruption or other aspects of the violence in Burundi, for example, there were significant limitations there as well. But at least we were able to understand young people's experience and begin to look at some ways in which they could strengthen social cohesion, recognizing that there were certain areas where there were severe limitations, which isn't surprising, I think, given the emergency context. I'll stop there. Armel, please add if yeah, go ahead, Armel.
Can we maybe help Armel unmute? I think he might be stuck on mute. Or have we lost him?
I'm afraid he dropped.
Oh, he's back.
Armel, over to you, if you have anything to add. I think maybe Armel is not connected. Okay. You know what? Let's move on to like 2 more questions, and then I think we might have to close this webinar. But I think there's some quite interesting ones. I think quite a few of the questions have been sort of answered in some ways or touched upon. So I'm going to try and just pick out some of the ones that maybe somebody, Brikiana, commented and said, I see gender equity as one of the root causes. I'm curious to know whether the groups have this kind of high level of awareness on gender equity or some approaches of the process that encourage that. So maybe that's something to talk about, just the sort of gender aspects of of your work.
Sure. Hi, Kenna. Nice to see you on the call. I would say unequivocally that the local women in the project had a very keen and exact understanding of the issues of gender inequity, and some interesting solutions in terms of how they felt there could be more gender equity, realizing, again, the limitations where they felt their power would not be effective in changing some of those dynamics. In both countries, I think Chad and Burundi at the local level, there are very strong networks of women, and women have to some extent been empowered through the work with international organizations and local CBOs. There are very strong women role models and leaders in the communities. However, at a systemic level, there's deep challenges, obviously, with regards to inclusion of girls and women, more broadly speaking, in society, and particularly, I think, as a result of the political violence in both countries. And maybe this is where it was useful to start with a focus on child protection, which is considered an acceptable place for women to be working, and through child protection to see where the limits might be for a broader community focus on women's empowerment, because that was happening in both countries. And I think even in Burundi, where, as I mentioned, there were probably more limitations on the focus on social cohesion than there were in Chad. I think women were quite successful in bringing some of their issues, particularly things like domestic violence, the need for women to travel long distance, economic inequality, and this was one of the reasons why both FES Ahmad and IRC started women's savings groups, is that was one of the issues that women had addressed early on, is that economic parity was something that needed to be addressed. So I'd say there was remarkable progress in some areas in regards to issues of women's empowerment, and a recognition that there were significant challenges that still remain, particularly at a political level.
Thanks, Philip. Armel, I realized that you only just got back online. Is there anything you wanted to add to the discussion so far?
It's fine from my end.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I think one final question, and I know some of you have sent in some really great ones, but I think one might be useful just to think going forward. Actually, it's from Colombia, from Alberto. He asks, what has been the reaction of political, military, and traditional authorities to the research's process, results, and action plan? So that's an interesting question, in terms of what the communities have come up with. You did touch on some of the aspects of not wanting to promote social cohesion, but could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that and perhaps where you think this might all be going so far?
Sure. Lucy, could you read the question again? Was it, what is the response of the government or the traditional leaders to that information?
It's actually all of them. So what has been the reaction of political, military, and traditional authorities to the research's process, results, and action plan?
Okay, great. Thank you. Gracias, Alberto. Yeah, it's a good question, and one that would probably take some time to unpack, but I'll do my best. I think in regards to the government in both countries, there was a welcoming of the work on child protection. I think this is an area where both the governments of Chad and Burundi want to be seen to be doing good work in light of their commitments to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I think particularly in light of the fact that they're being heavily criticized, particularly the government of Burundi, less so in Chad, but they're being criticized for other human rights violations. So I think they were quite happy to stand behind some of the recommendations and the engagement of community in the child protection endeavors. I think where it began to encroach more on social cohesion and, for example, talking about land rights, which was one of the issues that the Bashinganate were becoming more involved in Burundi, I think there was more resistance from government. Less so at some of the local levels, because I think there's still government officials who are open to that dialogue. And one of the things we were very careful about was not to engage in an early stage in the project in high-level advocacy, particularly in Burundi, where I think that could have harmed the outcomes of the project, and we didn't even involve the military in those discussions. I'm sure, however, that through the secret police in Burundi, the military was aware of what we were doing, and I think, again, as long as people perceive this to be a child protection project, there weren't problems. I think this will be an interesting challenge in the future stages of the project, as I think the focus on social cohesion, continues to grow, and there may be more resistance to some of the project activities. At the moment, it didn't seem to be a problem, and there was more of a self-regulation process, I think, within the communities, and this was interesting. I think where the communities knew themselves where the boundaries of safety were in terms of what they could do and what they couldn't do, and Alberto, I'm sure you've seen this in Colombia as well, but community members typically know where the boundaries are in terms of safe actions and where they're overstepping some of those boundaries. And in the initial steps, anyway, of this project, I think people were wanting to stay within the realm of safety and not move too quickly. And I think that aspect of UNICEF and the other partners not immediately engaging in high-level advocacy was an important part of that safety strategy as well. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Philip. So I think I've been asked, I can see Alex sending me a message saying, so what is the so what of all of this? So we've learned, we've listened to what you've been doing. So it's really fascinating and very complex. But what does this really mean for us as development practitioners? How does this apply to our work? And where should we be taking all of this? I know we're not expecting you, Philip or Armel, to have the answers to this, but if you've got any final thoughts on what this means perhaps for the kind of work that many of the people listening in might be doing, what would you want to highlight as your sort of takeaway points, perhaps?
Sure. Well, I think first and foremost, this should be encouraging news for those of us who feel that communities need to be more involved in community-based child protection initiatives and social cohesion more broadly. I think the evidence shows that communities want to be more involved, and in fact they have the resources, the knowledge, and the insights to be able to do that very effectively. I think it also shows the particular importance of certain groups within the community. It was very apparent in both countries that women, youth, and traditional leaders each have their own unique role to play and limitations in those roles. And I think each of them can do good work, and I think when you bring the three of them together, there's something quite unique where the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. And I think that was another interesting so what that emerged is when you have the right tools, and this is maybe another aspect of the so what, I think if you have the right tools that can help community members better understand their situations, reflect on that situation, and then take informed action based on their own knowledge with the right kind of support from NGOs, INGOs, and UN agencies, remarkable things can happen. Now, this is still very much in the early stages, so I think we need to be cautious in terms of the limitations, particularly in countries like Burundi. But I think that tools like outcome mapping and focusing on communities' involvement in measurement and action, that link between measurement and action, can be a very interesting way in strengthening not only child protection mechanisms, but social cohesion more broadly, and provide fruitful learning, I think, for all of us.
Thank you, Philip. That's great. We were also wondering, and we will close after this, but just in terms of this task force, one of the things that it's trying to achieve is to promote more evidence and learning, and the sharing of this evidence and learning, and the uptake of this evidence and learning into policy and programming. So I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, if there was anything actually from all of you, but Philip and Armel as well, that you felt the task force could perhaps focus on. You did mention support, the kind of support that UNICEF, et cetera, could give, but do you have any thoughts about this task force and what it could focus on to sort of take these kinds of, this kind of work, this kind of approaches and learning forward?
Well, I think, actually, that's a really interesting question, Lucy, and I appreciate it. You know, one thing I would say is, having shared in the process of the webinar today, it might be interesting for Armel and I to take your final question and share some reflections afterwards back to the task force, because I think it'd be helpful for the two of us to, and Jean as well, to have some time to reflect on that. I think briefly, though, my immediate reaction is certainly the aspect of sharing practice, or looking at that intersection between research and learning and practice in the way you're doing today is a really great way, particularly as you bring other examples forward to look at the richness of the experience that's going on. Perhaps beginning to raise some key cross-cutting issues. We've talked about power dynamics today, community-led versus community-based, the role of young people. I think, you know, youth in particular is an interesting one in humanitarian settings. I'm interested if others have had the same opportunities and challenges that we did, where youth can be a powerful partner for social change, but also in conflict settings are often at the very center of violence and conflict. Some of the gender dimensions, and I think some of these cross-cutting themes would be really interesting to look at in different contexts, bringing that systems lens to bear and looking at the importance of regional variation in some of the contextual factors that we've talked about today. But yeah, other than those, I think, you know, this is something that Armel, if it's useful for you, and I would be happy to maybe send some reflections following the webinar that could be circulated.
Thank you, Philip. That would be absolutely great. And of course, we will share them on with all of our networks and members and those who listened in today. I think we've probably run out of time today to talk about much else, but I just wanted to really thank you both, Philip and Armel, for taking this time to do this webinar. It was especially early for you, Philip, where you're based, so that's also very much appreciated. I will, like I said before, we will be recording this, or it has been recorded. We will be posting it, and I will be back in touch with you. And I think I was just going to ask Christine if you could perhaps display the kind of welcome page again at the end of this so that people can just get our emails and any other information they might need. And really to say thank you to all of you for listening in. And if Alex has any final words or anything she'd like to say, I think now is the time, and then I suggest we close after that. So thank you, everyone.
Sorry, hi. I didn't know if I had control over my mute. Thank you very, very much to everybody who joined, Lucy for facilitating, and Philip and Armel for your excellent presentation, as well as Christine for monitoring us on the IT side. I think this went extremely smoothly. I was collecting everyone's questions, and you know, Philip and Armel, everyone was very engaged in sending some very analytical and critical questions that, you know, I wish we could continue the conversation for a lot longer and explore it even deeper. So maybe if you don't mind, if you're going to come back to us with maybe some thoughts on what the task force can do, maybe I can also share with you some of these questions that you can reflect on as part of that and maybe address through your response that way. I'm very happy how this went, and I really hope that all of you as participants are able to share what you've learned back to your staff in country, because I think what is key here is bringing some of our learnings and you know, initiatives, new tools back to our frontline staff, because it's having the conversation at this level is one thing, but bringing it down to that level is where the real change happens, bottom up, as we all talk about. So, Christine, did you have any last words?
You said it all, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for participation.
Wonderful. So we will send just a follow-up to everybody with some of the documents, the presentations that Philip mentioned in his presentation. And I'll also ask probably for just a few questions of feedback, so that as we can progress through the rest of the webinar series, not only can maybe you contribute to the next potential topics, but also let us know logistically what went well, what could be improved, so that we can ensure the best optimal learning during these sessions. All right.
Thanks, Alex, Christine, and Alex. Yeah, Armel would also appreciate any feedback so we can improve our presentations in the future as well. But I just, before we leave, I wanted to thank you all for the opportunity for us to participate in this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. I think we've all said thank you. So I'm suggesting that we close this now, and obviously we will keep you posted on the follow-up that we've just been discussing. So feel free anytime to email any of us if you've got ideas or questions or just want to link with us. And we're always really happy to hear from everybody who's interested in this topic as well. So let's close the webinar, and we hope to have you back for the next time. We'll keep you posted on that too. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.